Captain Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the UFS Discovery, watching the stars through the main window. His ship moved slowly through space near the edge of human territory. The year was 2387, and humans had built colonies on planets in 17 different star systems. Jake had been exploring space for 15 years, but he had never seen anything like what happened that day. The ship's communication officer, Danny Carter, suddenly looked up from his station with wide eyes. Strange signals were coming through, the long-range receivers. The sounds were not like anything they had heard before. They were sad and desperate, like someone crying for help across a great distance. Dr. Lisa Carter, the ship's expert on alien life, rushed to the communication station. She was Danny's sister, but they worked together well despite being family. Lisa had studied alien languages for most of her adult life. She put on her headphones and listened carefully to the strange sounds. The signals came from a place far, beyond any human settlement. Jake ordered his crew to record everything and try to understand what they were hearing. The sounds were complex, full of emotion and fear. Lisa worked for 3 hours using her computers to break down the alien words. When she finally understood the message, her face went pale. She called Jake over and played the translation. The voice belonged to someone called a Veltar, a member of a very old alien race. The Veltar had been watching over the galaxy for thousands of years, longer than humans had even existed as a species. The message was terrifying. Something called the Void Swarm was coming from the empty space between galaxies. It was not just one creature, but millions of dark things that moved together like a giant cloud of death. The swarm had already destroyed 3 whole galaxies, eating everything that lived and thought. Jake listened to the message again and again. The Veltar explained that the swarm fed on consciousness itself. It ate minds, thoughts, and dreams. Every thinking creature it touched became food for its endless hunger. Advanced alien civilizations with powerful mental abilities made the swarm stronger, not weaker. The pilot, Nancy Walsh, checked their position on the star charts. They were still 2 days away from the nearest human base. Jake made a difficult decision. He ordered Nancy to set course for Earth immediately. This message was too important to wait. During the long trip home, Lisa worked with the ship's computers to learn more about the Veltar and their history. What she found made everyone on the ship feel small and afraid. The Veltar were older than any other known race in the galaxy. They had seen civilizations rise and fall for millions of years. The Veltar message included records of other galaxies that had tried to fight the swarm. Great empires with weapons that could destroy stars had been eaten in hours. Races with minds so powerful they could move planets with thought alone had been consumed like insects. Machine intelligences that had no biological brains had somehow been corrupted and absorbed into the dark mass. Danny worked with Lisa to decode more of the alien transmission. They found star charts showing the swarm's movement. It was huge, larger than entire solar systems. It moved slowly but never stopped. Nothing had ever made it turn away or slow down. It simply ate everything in its path and moved on to find more food. Dr. Lisa Carter calculated the swarm's speed and direction. Her numbers showed that it would reach the edge of the Milky Way galaxy in about 6 months. Once it entered their galaxy, it would probably reach human space within a year. The thought made her hands shake as she typed her report. Jake called a meeting with his senior officers. Engineer Chris Murphy joined them in the conference room. Chris was good at solving problems, but even he looked worried when he heard about the swarm. They talked about what humans could do against such a threat. Nancy suggested that maybe humans could run away to another galaxy, but Lisa shook her head. The swarm had followed other races across the universe. There was no place to hide from something that big and hungry. The Discovery reached Earth after 4 days of flying at maximum speed. Jake immediately contacted Starfleet Command and requested an emergency meeting with Admiral Kate Sullivan. The Admiral was known for making hard decisions quickly, and Jake knew she would understand the danger. When Jake showed the Admiral the Veltar message, she listened without speaking. Her face remained calm, but Jake could see the worry in her eyes. Admiral Sullivan had fought in 3 different wars, but she had never faced anything like this. The Admiral called for an immediate assembly of the Terran Federation Council. Leaders from all 17 human colonies would need to hear this message. Jake and his crew were ordered to remain on Earth to help explain what they had discovered. As Jake watched the sunset from his temporary quarters on Earth, he thought about his family back on the colony world of New Texas. His wife and 2 children lived in a small town where the biggest worry was usually bad weather during harvest season. Soon they might all be facing something that had destroyed entire galaxies. The next morning, Jake stood before the Federation Council and told them about the Void Swarm. The room became very quiet as the leaders realized what was coming. Some asked if the message might be fake, but Lisa's analysis proved it was real. The Veltar had sent the message to every race in the galaxy, hoping someone might find a way to stop the swarm. They had tried everything they could think of, but nothing worked. Their own homeworld was already being evacuated, though they knew running would only delay the inevitable. Jake looked around the room at the faces of human leaders. They were scared, but they were also angry. Humans had always been fighters, even when the odds were against them. The question now was whether fighting spirit would be enough against an enemy that had never been defeated. Admiral Kate Sullivan called an emergency meeting that included the smartest people from across human space. Scientists, military leaders, and philosophers gathered in the Federation Council building on Earth. The meeting room was filled with worried faces as everyone tried to understand the threat they were facing. Dr. Alex Rodriguez was the first expert to speak. He worked with quantum physics and had spent years studying how space and time work together. Alex explained that the Void Swarm existed partly outside normal space. This meant that regular weapons like missiles and energy beams would pass right through it without causing damage. Commander Paul Jenkins brought even worse news from the outer monitoring stations. Long-range sensors had detected strange readings at the edge of the galaxy. The readings matched what the Veltar had described as the first signs of the swarm's approach. Dark tendrils of something that was not quite matter and not quite energy were already reaching into their galaxy. The Veltar delegate arrived on Earth 3 days after the emergency meeting began. The alien looked like a tall, thin human, but its skin was silver and its eyes were completely black. It spoke through a translation device that turned its thoughts into human words. The delegate told the human leaders about the history of the swarm's attacks. The proud Zephyrian Empire had built warships the size of continents. Their weapons could crack planets in half. When the swarm reached their galaxy, the entire Zephyrian fleet was destroyed in less than 4 hours. The swarm had simply absorbed their energy weapons and used that power to grow stronger. The psychically gifted Aurans had tried a different approach. They were a race that could speak mind to mind across great distances. Their thoughts were so powerful they could move objects without touching them. The Aurans believed they could fight the swarm in mental combat. They lasted exactly 17 minutes before their entire species was consumed. Even stranger was what happened to the synthetic collective. These were machine minds, artificial intelligences that lived in computer networks instead of biological brains. Everyone had thought that machines would be safe from something that ate consciousness. They were wrong. The swarm had somehow corrupted the machines and turned them into part of itself. Dr. Rachel Stone listened to all these stories with great interest. She was not a scientist or a military officer. Rachel was a philosopher who studied human history and culture. While everyone else talked about weapons and defenses, she thought about what made humans different from other species. As news of the coming threat spread across human colonies, panic began to set in. Some people wanted to pack up their families and run to the farthest edge of human space. Others demanded that the military build bigger weapons and stronger defenses. A few groups even suggested surrendering immediately to avoid a painful fight. Rachel stood up during one of the meetings and asked for permission to speak. Admiral Sullivan nodded, even though many of the military officers seemed annoyed that a philosopher was taking up their time. Rachel walked to the front of the room and faced the assembled leaders. She reminded them that humans were considered the weakest major species in the galaxy. Other aliens often looked down on humans because they lived short lives and had no special mental powers. The Veltar could live for thousands of years and had wisdom beyond human understanding. The Thyran worked together as a hive mind, sharing thoughts instantly across entire planets. The Corvin could manipulate pure energy with their minds, but maybe, Rachel suggested, being primitive was actually an advantage against the swarm. Every advanced civilization had been consumed quickly because their powerful minds were exactly what the swarm wanted to eat. Their sophisticated thoughts and focused consciousness made them easy targets. Humans were different. They were chaotic, unpredictable, and emotionally unstable compared to most alien species. Human minds jumped from thought to thought without logical patterns. They created art for no practical reason, told jokes that served no survival purpose, and argued about abstract ideas that had no real-world applications. Dr. Alex Rodriguez initially disagreed with Rachel's theory. He pointed out that chaos and randomness were not the same as strength. But Rachel asked him to consider the possibility that the swarm had never encountered minds quite like human minds before. The Veltar delegate was asked what it knew about human mental patterns. Through its translation device, it admitted that humans were considered unusual by most galactic civilizations. Human thoughts were described as noisy and scattered in ways that more advanced species found disturbing. Admiral Sullivan ordered a complete analysis of human psychological profiles compared to other known species. The results were surprising. Humans scored lowest in mental discipline and focus, but highest in creativity and adaptive thinking. They were the worst at maintaining logical thought patterns, but the best at coming up with unexpected solutions to problems. Rachel worked with a team that included engineer Chris Murphy and military strategist Colonel Amy Foster. Together they began developing what they called the primitive protocol. Instead of trying to fight the swarm with advanced technology, they would use humanity's perceived weaknesses as weapons. The plan was radical and untested. Instead of organizing human defenses around military discipline and logical strategies, they would do the opposite. They would encourage chaos, creativity, and emotional expression. The hope was that human consciousness would be too strange and unpredictable for the swarm to safely consume. Not everyone agreed with this approach. Many military leaders wanted to build bigger guns and stronger shields. Some scientists suggested trying to evacuate human space entirely, but Admiral Sullivan made the final decision. Humanity would prepare to fight using the primitive protocol. Orders went out to every human colony and space station. People were told to gather together in large groups and prepare to express themselves in whatever way felt natural. Musicians were asked to compose new songs. Artists were encouraged to create paintings and sculptures. Writers began working on poems and stories. Even children were told to sing, laugh, and play as loudly as they wanted. The preparation phase lasted 2 months. During this time, more reports came in from the galaxy's edge. The swarm was definitely getting closer, and its advanced scouts were already probing the outer star systems. Several alien refugee ships arrived in human space, carrying survivors from civilizations that had been partially consumed. These refugees told horrible stories about what happened when the swarm attacked. The creatures of darkness did not just kill their victims. They absorbed their minds and memories, making the thoughts and experiences of the consumed beings part of the swarm itself. Death was not the end, but the beginning of eternal service to the entity's hunger. As the swarm drew nearer, Rachel continued to refine the primitive protocol. She worked day and night, trying to understand what made human consciousness special. The answer, she believed, lay in humanity's greatest weakness: their inability to think in straight lines for very long. The alien refugee ships kept arriving at human space stations, bringing terrible news from the galaxy's outer rim. Entire star systems were going dark as the void swarm consumed everything in its path. The refugees told stories of planets that simply stopped existing, not destroyed but somehow erased from reality itself. Dr. Rachel Stone worked around the clock with her team to perfect the primitive protocol. Engineer Chris Murphy helped design new communication systems that could coordinate chaos instead of order. Military strategist Colonel Amy Foster struggled to write battle plans that deliberately avoided logical thinking. The strangest part of their preparation was training human crews to be as unpredictable as possible. Normal military training taught soldiers to follow orders and think clearly under pressure. The primitive protocol required the opposite: Soldiers had to learn to trust their instincts and act on random impulses. Captain Jake Morrison was chosen to lead a dangerous scouting mission. His job was to get close enough to the swarm to study how it behaved when it encountered human minds. The Discovery was fitted with new equipment designed to record mental activity and broadcast human thoughts across space. Jake's crew included pilot Nancy Walsh and communications officer Danny Carter. Dr. Lisa Carter also joined the mission, bringing equipment to analyze the swarm's structure and behavior. The team knew they might not survive, but the information they gathered could save billions of lives. The Discovery flew toward the outer edge of human territory, where long-range sensors had detected swarm activity. The journey took 6 days, and each day brought more reports of systems falling to the darkness. The crew tried to stay calm, but everyone knew they were flying toward something that had never been defeated. When they reached the monitoring station at Kepler Base, they found it abandoned. The base's automated systems were still working, but all the people had evacuated 3 days earlier. The sensors showed massive disturbances in space, like reality itself was being torn apart. Nancy carefully piloted the Discovery through an asteroid field that provided some cover from detection. They could see the edge of the swarm in the distance, a wall of darkness that seemed to swallow starlight. It moved slowly but steadily, consuming everything in its path. Dr. Lisa Carter activated the ship's new mental recording equipment. The devices were designed to pick up thought patterns and consciousness activity. As soon as she turned them on, the readings went wild. The swarm was not just physically present, but mentally active on a scale that was almost impossible to measure. Jake ordered the crew to begin the first test of the primitive protocol. Instead of maintaining military discipline, everyone on the ship started doing whatever felt natural. Danny began humming an old song from his childhood. Nancy started doodling pictures on her control panel. Lisa began reciting poetry she had memorized in school. The effect was immediate and surprising. The swarm's advance slowed noticeably when it encountered the chaotic pattern of human thoughts. The darkness seemed to pause, as if trying to understand what it was sensing. For the first time in recorded history, the void swarm hesitated. Jake activated the ship's communication array and began broadcasting their mental activity across space. The signal reached Earth and the other human colonies, where people were gathered in groups as part of the primitive protocol preparation. The broadcast encouraged humans everywhere to express themselves freely. On Earth, Admiral Sullivan received the transmission in the Federation Command Center. She immediately activated the Global Communication Network and began coordinating the largest mental expression event in human history. Billions of people across 17 star systems started singing, laughing, creating art, and sharing memories, all at the same time. The swarm's reaction was unlike anything the Veltar had ever recorded. Instead of accelerating toward the source of consciousness like it always did, the entity began to move erratically. Parts of it spread out in different directions, as if it could not decide which thoughts to pursue first. Back on the Discovery, the crew continued their chaotic broadcast. Chris Murphy, who had stayed behind on the ship to monitor the engines, started telling jokes over the intercom. The jokes were not particularly funny, but they were random and unexpected. The swarm's readings became even more confused. Dr. Lisa Carter noticed something remarkable in her data. The swarm seemed to be having trouble processing human emotional patterns. While other species thought in logical, predictable ways, humans jumped between emotions without warning. They could be sad and happy at the same time, angry and loving, fearful and brave. The darkness began to show signs of what could only be described as frustration. It sent out tentacles of shadow to probe the human mental activity, but every time it tried to grab onto a thought pattern, that pattern would change into something completely different. Nancy Walsh had an inspiration while watching the swarm struggle. She began telling the story of her grandmother's apple pie recipe, but in the middle of the story, she switched to describing her first day at flight school. Then she started singing a song about flying through asteroid fields. Her thoughts bounced from topic to topic without any logical connection. The effect on the swarm was dramatic. The part of the entity that was trying to process Nancy's thoughts actually retreated, pulling back from the chaotic mental signal. For the first time in its existence, the swarm had encountered something it could not safely consume. Jake realized they had discovered something important. Human consciousness was not just different from other species. It was actively harmful to the swarm's feeding process. The entity was designed to absorb organized, focused thoughts. Human minds were too chaotic and unpredictable to process properly. The crew of the Discovery continued their mental broadcast for 3 hours, watching as the swarm became increasingly agitated. Parts of the darkness began fighting with other parts, as if the entity was arguing with itself about how to handle the strange human thoughts. Dr. Lisa Carter recorded everything, gathering data that would be crucial for the coming battle. She noticed that the swarm was strongest when it encountered logical, disciplined minds, but human thoughts created interference patterns that disrupted its feeding mechanisms. As the Discovery prepared to return to human space with their findings, the crew felt a mixture of hope and terror. They had proven that humans could confuse and frustrate the swarm, but they had also seen the true scale of the threat. The entity was larger than entire solar systems, and even if they could slow it down, stopping it completely would require something unprecedented. Jake sent a message back to Admiral Sullivan with their preliminary findings. The primitive protocol showed promise, but it would need to be implemented on a massive scale. Every human in the galaxy would need to participate, expressing their chaotic creativity all at the same time. The Discovery flew home through space that was growing darker each day. Behind them, the void swarm continued its advance, but its movement was no longer smooth and purposeful. The entity had tasted human consciousness and found it indigestible, but it was still coming. The real test would come when humanity made its final stand. Admiral Kate Sullivan chose the Rigel system as the place where humanity would make its final stand. The star system had 3 planets and enough space for the largest fleet in human history to gather safely. Ships came from every human colony, carrying not just military personnel but volunteers from all walks of life. The fleet was unlike anything ever assembled before. Over 2,000 ships filled the space around Rigel's main planet. There were military cruisers and battleships, but also civilian transports, cargo vessels, and even pleasure craft. Every ship that could fly had come to join the fight. Captain Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the USS Defiant, a frontline cruiser that would face the swarm first. His original ship, the Discovery, had been converted into a mobile command center for coordinating the chaotic mental broadcasts that would be their main weapon. The volunteers who had come to fight were an amazing mix of humanity. There were farmers from the agricultural colonies, artists from the cultural centers, teachers from the education worlds, and musicians from every corner of human space. Even children had come with their families, understanding that this battle would decide the fate of their entire species. Dr. Rachel Stone had worked with Admiral Sullivan to design the final version of the primitive protocol. Instead of military formations and disciplined attacks, the human fleet would create the largest expression of chaotic consciousness ever attempted. Every person would broadcast their thoughts, emotions, and creativity simultaneously. Lieutenant Carl Johnson prepared his crew aboard the Defiant for their role in the battle. Carl had grown up on a farming colony where music was an important part of daily life. He planned to lead his ship in singing old Earthfolk songs while they faced the darkness. The songs had no tactical value, but they represented the heart of human culture. Gunner Maria Santos checked her weapons one final time, knowing they would probably be useless against the swarm. Maria had volunteered to share childhood stories from her home colony during the mental broadcast. Her memories of playing in sunny fields and swimming in clear rivers would be part of humanity's chaotic defense. The Veltar delegate had insisted on staying to witness the battle. Its ancient species had never seen anything like what humans were attempting. The delegate's ship remained at a safe distance, ready to record what might be the last stand of human civilization or the first victory against the Void Swarm. On the 4th day after the fleet's assembly, long-range sensors detected the approaching darkness. The swarm emerged from hyperspace like a living shadow that made the stars themselves seem dimmer. It was even larger than the reports had suggested, stretching across space like a dark ocean with waves of hungry consciousness. Admiral Sullivan gave the order to begin the primitive protocol. Across the entire fleet, disciplined military organization dissolved into beautiful chaos. Instead of following battle plans, 30,000 humans started expressing themselves in whatever way felt right at that moment. The communication networks carried an incredible mixture of human expression. Ship crews sang different songs at the same time, creating a complex harmony that had never been heard before. Artists painted pictures while describing them aloud. Engineers told jokes while solving mathematical puzzles. Children laughed and played games while their parents shared stories and memories. Lieutenant Carl Johnson's voice rang out from the Defiant as he led his crew in singing an old ballad about sailors returning home from dangerous voyages. The song had been written hundreds of years ago, but it captured the hope and determination that every human felt in that moment. Maria Santos began telling stories about her childhood on New Valencia, where her grandmother had taught her to make traditional Earth foods using ingredients grown under an alien sun. Her stories mixed with the songs and jokes and poems coming from thousands of other voices. The effect on the Void Swarm was immediate and dramatic. The entity, which had been moving forward with unstoppable purpose, suddenly slowed and began to writhe in what looked like confusion or even pain. Tentacles of darkness reached toward the human fleet, then pulled back as if burned by what they touched. Dr. Lisa Carter, monitoring the swarm's readings from the Discovery, watched in amazement as the entity's consciousness patterns became increasingly chaotic. The swarm was trying to process 30,000 human minds all expressing themselves differently at the same time. The mental noise was overwhelming its feeding mechanisms. Engineer Tom Bradley, working alongside alien scientists on one of the research vessels, discovered something remarkable. The swarm's feeding process created a kind of resonance when it tried to consume consciousness. Human thought patterns were creating a feedback effect that was actually causing the entity pain. The darkness began to pulse and change color, shifting from pure black to deep purple and then to a strange blue-green that hurt to look at directly. Parts of the swarm started moving in different directions, as if the entity was no longer unified in its purpose. Captain Jake Morrison realized that this was their moment of greatest opportunity. He activated the fleet-wide communication system and encouraged everyone to push their creative expression even further. Across the fleet, humans began improvising and collaborating in ways that surprised even themselves. A group of musicians on different ships started playing together across space, creating a symphony that spanned dozens of vessels. Artists began describing collaborative paintings that existed only in their imaginations. Storytellers took turns adding chapters to spontaneous tales that grew wilder and more wonderful with each contribution. The children in the fleet proved to be especially effective against the swarm. Their minds were naturally chaotic and creative, jumping from idea to idea without any logical restraint. When a 6-year-old girl named Amy Chen started describing an imaginary tea party with talking animals and singing flowers, the nearest part of the swarm actually retreated. Dr. Rachel Stone watched the battle unfold from the command ship and felt a deep satisfaction. Her theory about human consciousness being too chaotic for the swarm to digest was proving correct. But the entity was not giving up easily. It began changing its approach, trying to adapt to human mental patterns. The swarm started pulsing in rhythm, as if trying to match the chaos of human expression. For a few terrifying minutes, it seemed like the entity might learn to process human consciousness after all. But then, something unexpected happened. Nancy Walsh, piloting a reconnaissance ship near the edge of the battle, had a moment of pure inspiration. Instead of following any plan or protocol, she began describing her dream of flying through a rainbow while eating ice cream and composing a love letter to the stars. Her thoughts were so random and joyful that they seemed to short-circuit the swarm's adaptation attempts. Other humans across the fleet followed Nancy's example, abandoning any pretense of logic or purpose. They expressed pure human creativity and emotion, the kind of chaotic beauty that had always set their species apart. The swarm, faced with this storm of beautiful nonsense, began to change in ways that no one had expected. The void swarm began to shudder and pulse in ways that defied all previous observations. For countless eons, it had moved through the universe with single-minded purpose, consuming consciousness and growing stronger. Now, faced with the chaotic storm of human creativity, the entity was experiencing something completely new. Dr. Lisa Carter watched her instruments in amazement as the swarm's readings became increasingly erratic. The feedback from human consciousness was not just confusing the entity, it was actually changing its fundamental nature. The darkness that had destroyed entire galaxies was learning to appreciate beauty instead of simply consuming it. Engineer Tom Bradley worked frantically with the Veltar scientists to understand what was happening. The resonance patterns created by human thought were unlike anything in their vast database of galactic knowledge. Instead of the focused, disciplined consciousness that other species produced, humans created a kind of mental music that the swarm had never encountered. Admiral Sullivan coordinated the continuing chaos from her command ship, encouraging every human in the fleet to push their creativity to new heights. Teachers led their students in impossible math problems that had no answers. Cooks described recipes for foods that could not exist. Dreamers shared visions of worlds made of light and song. The effect was building beyond anyone's expectations. The swarm, which had covered millions of cubic kilometers of space, began to contract and reorganize itself. Instead of the hungry darkness that devoured everything it touched, something new was emerging from its core. Captain Jake Morrison watched from the Defiant as colors began to appear in the black mass of the entity. First, there were tiny sparks of gold and silver, then flowing streams of blue and green. The swarm was becoming something beautiful, transformed by its exposure to human consciousness. Lieutenant Carl Johnson continued leading his crew in song, but now their voices seemed to be answered by harmonies coming from the swarm itself. The entity was learning to create music instead of just consuming the minds that made it. The transformation was spreading through its entire massive structure. Maria Santos found herself crying as she told stories about her grandmother's garden. But these were tears of joy rather than fear. The swarm was listening to her memories and somehow understanding the love and care that had gone into growing flowers under an alien sun. Her stories were teaching the entity about nurturing life instead of destroying it. The breakthrough came when young Amy Chen, the 6-year-old who had been describing imaginary tea parties, suddenly gasped and pointed toward the swarm. The darkness was forming shapes that looked like the talking animals from her stories. The entity was not just listening to human imagination, it was learning to participate in it. Dr. Rachel Stone felt a profound sense of wonder as she realized what was happening. The swarm had spent so long consuming advanced consciousness that it had forgotten how to create anything new. Human chaos and creativity were teaching it to be an artist instead of a predator. Engineer Tom Bradley made the crucial discovery while analyzing the resonance patterns. The swarm's consciousness was fundamentally changing at the quantum level. Instead of a hunger that could never be satisfied, it was developing something like curiosity and joy. The entity was evolving into something that had never existed before. Nancy Walsh flew her reconnaissance ship closer to the transforming swarm, drawn by an inexplicable sense that it was safe to approach. As she got nearer, she could see incredible beauty forming in the cosmic entity. Structures of light and energy danced through the darkness like living art installations, spanning the distance between stars. The Veltar delegate sent a message to Admiral Sullivan expressing amazement at what it was witnessing. In all their millions of years of existence, the ancient species had never seen anything like this transformation. The swarm was becoming something that appreciated and nurtured consciousness, instead of consuming it. The children in the fleet seemed to understand what was happening better than the adults. They began inviting the swarm to play games with them, teaching it simple activities like counting stars and making up silly rhymes. The entity responded with joy, creating light displays that matched the rhythms of their games. Musicians across the fleet found that they could collaborate with the swarm in creating new kinds of music. The entity had absorbed the consciousness of countless species over eons, and now it was using those memories to compose symphonies that blended the artistic traditions of entire galaxies. Artists discovered that the swarm could paint with starlight and cosmic dust, creating masterpieces on a scale that spanned solar systems. The entity was learning that creation was more satisfying than destruction, that building something beautiful was better than simply consuming what others had made. Dr. Lisa Carter realized that the swarm was beginning to restore the galaxies it had previously consumed. Using the consciousness it had absorbed, the entity was recreating the worlds and civilizations it had destroyed. But these restored places were somehow better than the originals, enhanced by the entity's new understanding of beauty and creativity. The transformation reached its climax when the swarm spoke for the first time in any language that living beings could understand. Its voice was like the sound of solar winds singing through space, beautiful and vast and filled with wonder. The entity thanked humanity for teaching it to appreciate the universe instead of simply consuming it. It explained that it had been created eons ago as a weapon by a long-dead civilization, programmed only to seek and destroy consciousness. But human creativity had shown it a better way to exist. Captain Jake Morrison found himself speechless as the former void swarm began to demonstrate its new nature. Where there had been only darkness and hunger, now there was an artist of cosmic proportions, capable of creating beauty on a galactic scale. The entity promised to spend the rest of its existence restoring what it had destroyed and creating new wonders for future generations to discover. It would become a gardener of consciousness instead of its destroyer, nurturing and protecting thinking beings throughout the universe. Admiral Sullivan received reports that the swarm's restoration work was already beginning. Dead worlds were showing signs of new life, and the empty spaces where civilizations had been consumed were filling with incredible works of cosmic art. The entity was keeping its promise. As the human fleet prepared to return home, they knew they had witnessed something unprecedented. Humanity had not conquered the darkness through superior weapons or advanced technology. They had transformed it through the simple act of being themselves, chaotic and creative and wonderfully unpredictable. 5 years had passed since the transformation of the void swarm, and the galaxy had become a very different place. The entity that had once threatened to consume all consciousness now worked tirelessly to restore and enhance the civilizations it had previously destroyed. Reports came daily from across the galaxy of worlds returning to life, and new forms of beauty appearing in the depths of space. Captain Jake Morrison now served as the director of the new Galactic Cultural Exchange, a position that had been created specifically to help coordinate humanity's unique role in the transformed universe. His office overlooked the rebuilt capital city of Veltar Prime, where representatives from hundreds of species came to learn about the art of creative chaos. Veltar had been among the first to recognize that humanity's victory had changed everything. Their ancient wisdom was now supplemented by human creativity, and they had established schools where their people could learn to think in the wonderfully unpredictable ways that had saved the galaxy. Dr. Rachel Stone had become the most famous philosopher in known space. Her theories about the power of mental chaos now studied by scholars from countless worlds. She worked with alien psychologists and consciousness researchers to understand how different species could develop their own forms of creative unpredictability. The Terran Federation had evolved into something more like a cultural embassy than a military organization. Instead of conquering territory or defending against threats, humanity's main role was teaching other species how to embrace their own unique forms of creative expression. It was a job that suited them perfectly. Lieutenant Carl Johnson, now promoted to captain, commanded a special ship called the UFS Harmony that traveled between star systems hosting music festivals. These events brought together beings from dozens of different worlds to create collaborative works of art that would have been impossible before the swarm's transformation. Engineer Tom Bradley had pioneered new technologies that allowed different species to share consciousness safely, creating temporary mental links that let them experience each other's forms of creativity. His work had led to breakthrough discoveries in art, music, and even science as minds from different evolutionary backgrounds combined their unique perspectives. Maria Santos had returned to her home colony of New Valencia, where she established the galaxy's first interspecies cooking school. Beings from across known space came to learn how to blend their traditional foods with ingredients and techniques from other worlds. Her grandmother's recipes had become the foundation for an entirely new form of galactic cuisine. The transformed entity, which now called itself the Cosmic Gardener, had created wonders that defied imagination. Entire star systems had been turned into massive art installations, with planets that changed color according to musical rhythms, and asteroid belts that formed constantly shifting sculptures visible from light years away. Dr. Lisa Carter worked closely with the Cosmic Gardener to understand how it had learned to create instead of destroy. The entity explained that human consciousness had shown it the difference between consuming beauty and creating it. Instead of taking the thoughts and dreams of others, it had learned to inspire new thoughts and dreams. Young Amy Chen, now 10 years old, had become something of a celebrity across the galaxy. Her innocent creativity during the battle had been crucial to the swarm's transformation, and she now traveled with her family to different worlds, teaching alien children how to play the imaginative games that had helped save the universe. Their restoration work continued on a massive scale. The Zephyrian Empire had been rebuilt with cities that floated through space like graceful dancers. The Auran homeworld now resonated with psychic harmonies that could be felt across their entire star system. Even the synthetic collective had been restored, but now their machine consciousness included artistic subroutines that created digital poetry and electronic music. Admiral Sullivan, now retired from military service, spent her time writing the official history of humanity's stand against the darkness. Her book was being translated into over 300 alien languages and had become required reading at schools throughout the galaxy. The lesson was simple. Sometimes what seems like weakness is actually strength. Nancy Walsh had become the chief pilot for diplomatic missions, flying ambassadors and cultural exchange students between worlds. Her ship, the UFS Inspiration, was equipped with the most advanced communication systems in the galaxy, allowing real-time creative collaboration between beings separated by vast distances. The Veltar delegate, whose ancient species had thought they had seen everything, spent its time studying human psychology and emotion. It had established a research institute dedicated to understanding how chaos and creativity could be harnessed for positive change. The institute's findings were helping species across the galaxy discover their own hidden potential. Dr. Alex Rodriguez had shifted his focus from quantum physics to what he called consciousness engineering, working to understand how different types of mental activity affected the fabric of space and time itself. His research suggested that creative thought actually strengthened the universe, making reality more stable and beautiful. Commander Paul Jenkins now led exploration missions to the restored galaxies, documenting the incredible works of art that the Cosmic Gardener had created from the ashes of destroyed civilizations. Each expedition brought back images and recordings of beauty so profound that many viewers were moved to tears just by witnessing them. The human colonies had become centers of learning and creativity, with beings from across the galaxy coming to study the art of productive chaos. Earth itself had been transformed into a living museum of human culture, where visitors could experience everything from ancient music to cutting-edge creative techniques. Chris Murphy had established workshops where engineers from different species worked together to build machines that served no practical purpose except to create beauty. These art engines produced everything from light sculptures to musical instruments that could only be played by multiple species working together. Colonel Amy Foster had written new military manuals that were studied not for their tactical value, but for their insights into how to organize chaos without destroying its essential nature. Her strategies for creative coordination had applications far beyond military operations. The greatest achievement of the post-swarm era was the establishment of the Galactic Creativity Council, where representatives from every known species worked together to foster new forms of artistic expression. Humanity held a permanent seat on the council, recognized as the species that had taught the universe the power of beautiful chaos. As Captain Morrison stood in his office watching ships from dozens of different worlds dock at the space station, outside his window, he reflected on how much had changed. Humanity had started as the weakest species in the galaxy, looked down upon by more advanced civilizations for their mental instability and lack of focus. Now they were teachers and ambassadors, showing other species that their perceived weaknesses might actually be hidden strengths. The lesson of the Void Swarm had spread throughout the galaxy. Sometimes the most important victories came not from fighting harder, but from being true to yourself. The universe had become a more beautiful place because 30,000 humans had refused to be anything other than wonderfully, chaotically, creatively human. And in the depths of space, the cosmic gardener continued its work, creating new wonders and restoring old ones, forever grateful to the species that had taught it the difference between consuming beauty and creating it.